Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure as the to the UNESCO International Institute for Educational Planning. I'm Suzanne Grant-Lewis. I would like to welcome you who are here with us physically at IIEP, as well as our online audience, which I think way outnumbers what we have in the room. We're very, very pleased to have all of you with us today. And I want to remind you that we are to please be active on Twitter, #Strategic Debate. But I can say also that our guests each are active on Twitter, and I will give you their Twitter handles at Najat, Najat VB, and at STE Giannini. So Stefania Giannini, STE Giannini. And I'm, of course, at Sue Grant Lewis and at IIEP_UNESCO. So this is IIEP's 7th strategic debate of 2018. And the theme for this year has been SDG 4's learning objective, looking beyond the obvious. Today, we were looking at learning of a particular nature, of a particular education actor, the learning that took place by ministers of education. And we're very pleased that they're here to share with us today some of the lessons that they learned about the challenges of educational policy making. With this new angle for the looking beyond the obvious, we also chose to move to a different format, one that is more conducive to a conversation with the former ministers and also between the ministers. So I'd like to just briefly introduce you to the format before getting started with introductions of our guests. We're going to start with 10-15 minutes of questions and answers, which I will moderate. And then we'll turn to each of the ministers in turn to talk about a signature reform that they want to share. And we've asked a few guiding questions to help them prepare, such as why was this signature reform necessary? What were the controversial aspects? How did you confront or overcome opposition? And in what form was shape did the form take place? And then we'll move to having an exchange between the two ministers who know each other because they served at common times, common years. We'll then move on to ask a few more questions that are much more tied to the policymaking process and interactions with different stakeholders. And then we'll end with a question and answer period in which we will receive questions from the audience, both online and here with us at IIEP. There are pieces of paper and pens that
des feuilles de papier et des crayons qui seront distribués pour que vous puissiez noter vos questions et ensuite nous les passerons à Estelle qui les lira. Le séminaire devrait terminer aux alentours de 18h et ensuite nous vous inviterons pour un cocktail à l'étage supérieur et ce sera un plaisir de vous y recevoir. Est-ce qu'il y a des questions jusque-là? Donc, c'est maintenant un plaisir de vous présenter nos invités, ce que je vais faire en français.
Sous-directeur général de l'UNESCO pour l'éducation depuis mai de cette année, devenant ainsi la plus haute responsable des Nations Unies dans le domaine de l'éducation. En cette qualité, elle fournit au secteur de l'éducation de l'UNESCO une vision et un leadership stratégique dans la coordination
in the coordination and the monitoring of the implementation
de développement durable 4. Docteur en linguistique, Madame Giannini est devenue professeure de linguistique en 1992 et a été rectrice de l'Université pour étrangers de Pérouse de 2004 à 2012, devenant l'une des premières femmes rectrices et la plus jeune à cette époque en Italie. Durant ces années, Madame Giannini a coordonné un certain nombre de projets internationaux dans le domaine de l'enseignement supérieur et de la recherche, contribuant à l'amélioration de la coopération universitaire entre l'Europe et plusieurs autres pays, des États-Unis aux pays d'Asie, ainsi que du Moyen-Orient et d'Afrique du Nord. Elle a également été, entre autres, membre de la Commission nationale pour la promotion de la culture italienne à l'étranger au ministère des Affaires étrangères de 2006 à 2011. Sénatrice,
Was also a senator.
Et ministre de l'Éducation, des universités et de la recherche de 2014 et 2016. Elle a élaboré et mis en œuvre une réforme structurelle du système éducatif italien, axée sur l'inclusion sociale et la sensibilisation à la culture. Madame Giannini a également présidé le Conseil de compétitivité de l'Union européenne durant la présidence italienne et second semestre de 2014. Outre son poste actuel, elle est conseillère auprès du commissaire européen à la recherche, à la science et à l'innovation et membre du groupe Atlantis de la Fondation Vaki et de RISE, Research, Innovation and Science Policy Experts. Bienvenue. Merci.
Mrs. Giannini. Mrs. Najat Vallaud-Belkacem is now Deputy Director General in charge of International Studies and Social Innovation with Ipsos, a company, and she's in charge of the collection Raison de Plus with the editorial Fayard. Najat Vallaud-Belkacem has herself published several books, amongst which one can mention Réagissez, which was published in 2011, and La vie a plus d'imagination que toi in 2017. Mrs. Vallaud-Belkacem is a graduate of IIEP, the Institute of Political Paris, the Paris Institute of Political Studies, and after working as a lawyer for several years, she worked from 2003 for a couple of years to at the town hall of Lyon, and then at the regional council of the region of Rhône-Alpes, and she was namely in charge of the cultural policy. Mrs. Vallaud-Belkacem was one of the spokespersons to both the candidates to the French presidential elections. One was Ségolène Royal in 2007, and the other one was François Hollande in 2012. She was appointed Minister for the Rights of Women, for the City, Youth and Sports, and spokesperson of the first government under President François Hollande in 2012 until August of 2014. And from 2014 to 2017, Najat Vallaud-Belkacem was appointed Minister for National Education, Higher Education, and Research. She's the first woman to have been appointed at this particular position, and as a minister, she was the one who carried out the reform of high school education in 2015.
Question that I think many ministers reflect on after leaving office, and that is, what do you wish you knew before you took office? Before you became a minister, what is it you wish you knew? Would you like to start?
Ça va? Oh oui, merci. Alors.
Very good. I'm glad it's working now. First of all, allow me to thank you. Thank you for this very kind information to attend your event. It's a great pleasure for me to be here alongside Najat Vallaud-Belkacem, who's a friend and a colleague. We have a shared experience, which is that of a ministry, a light one, might one say, tongue-in-cheek, but I think we can shed some light on the matter from the position we both held. The last time we met each other, that was last year, I believe, we actually danced We dance together. That's the last time we met. We danced for education, yes, because this was at an international conference on education. So if you'll allow me, I would like to answer your question, and I will answer it in English.
Very, very crucial question. What can I say? I should say that, yes, I thought a lot of times about it. What should be useful for me to be a better minister, to be familiar with the big challenges that you have to face in that position. Yes, the first thing I think should be very useful, knowledge of the position itself, and I didn't know it. I didn't know really that to be Minister of Education can be really, really more dangerous than swimming in a pool surrounded by sharks, really. And I'm not joking, because when you touch education in a country, I think it's something that we know, we share in all different regions of the world, different parties, different kind of reforms. You touch something which is really crucial for everybody's life. So I went there with a lot of passion. You journalists read my CV, and you saw that all my life I was in some way in education. So I thought that it was really, really something very important, and I think it is, as a matter of fact. And personally also, yes, the modest things I did in my life, they are there because of education, because I come from a very modest family, and because of education, you know, I could realize myself. I could, you know, have my personal view about the context I live, the things I face, the people I meet, and the choices I take. So I think that education is really the basis. And but I didn't know that it's a very, very dangerous position. But we can survive. We survived, both of us, and I mean, explain also in a very beautiful context, I think. The second thing I knew is that how can I say, education at national level has a high political value, but it's not so easy to connect the national level, the political debate at national level, with the main issues and the big challenges at international level. It's something different, because when you move there, you have to consider that people are more interested to what's happening in the classroom every day with their children, and it's correct, I think. And teachers want to know about their future, which will be their salary, if they increase or not, and something. And it's difficult to raise up the debate at the highest level as you like to do. So I learned both these two things, and I survived, just considering that education is still the most important thing we can deal with.
Thank you. I will speak in French.
Oui, naturally.
Hi, everybody.
Microphone, please. Speaker, can you ask the speaker to use the microphone? Thanks. Microphone. Actually, a bit closer. We can't hear. Just a bit closer. Can the speaker use the microphone closer to her mouth, because the sound is not too good? Closer to her mouth, if she doesn't mind. A bit closer. Hold the microphone closer. Would that be possible? Sorry to trouble her. The sound is not too, but that is fantastic. Thank you. Thank you. So, to answer the question that was put to me, quite honestly, it's difficult to sum it up in only one sentence, because there's a host of things that we know much better after having done the job as a minister than when you start before doing the job. Then I'm absolutely convinced that if we had an opportunity to do it all over again, we would be much better. But if I were to remember one single thing, and in this particular ministry, that of education, I would say that I would have loved to get an explanation beforehand of how all of the discussions around education are not and never will be up to notch and in line with the way things are today. I would have loves to being able to be able to understand the gap there is between the discussions that are essential, 65 million individuals who have a right to education and all of that. I mean, 65 million ministers of education, in other words. I mean, no, I'm just kidding, but I'm saying the discussion is fascinating, but discussions seem to focus on matters that are not essential and that are not in line with the reality of challenges in education and the complexity of these challenges. I would have loved to be told there is a gap between the way people understand things, what they imagine, what they consider as important on the one hand, and on the other hand, the complexity of the difficulties and challenges we're faced with as ministers of education. Why would it have been better to understand it beforehand? Well, because once you understood it, you can deal with both. You can do the groundwork on complex challenges and do it in silence, little by little, and try and solve the problems and overcome the challenges. And at the same time, take part in discussions, work with observers, different opinions, with the messages that are expected, and hoping at the same time that you can bring the public opinion in line with the reality. It's not easy what I've just said. I mean, even if I've understood it today, I still claim that it's not easy because time in politics is very short. Things go fast. You have little time to do everything at the same time. All this to say that for any minister of education who would start in capacity, if I were to give him or her any piece of advice, I would say bear in mind that unfortunately observers and the public opinion are not necessarily as well informed as specialists in education because they know what it's all about. They know what needs to be done. We all know what needs to be done anyway. It's not as if there were any uncertainty or any doubt about it. But we cannot move forward if the public at large, the public opinion is not dragged along. So there are messages to convey.
Both of you came into office as ministers in 2014, and it was a period in which the world was reassessing the Millennium Development Goals and starting to design the new, what were to be universal goals of Sustainable Development Goals. Could you say something about what influence did the Sustainable Development Goals discussion have on your time in office? Was it, did it affect your agenda? Was it, did it place education in a broader framework for how your Italy or France wanted to see itself in the international stage?
I can say something. Yes, thank you so much. You know, sustainability, Agenda 2030, now it's a common language in my daily life, but it was also then because, you know, coming from the higher education sector, the question of sustainability in some way, it was something familiar for me. And I hoped it could be possible to relaunch this topic in the education sector, because in my case, the big reform we tried and we succeeded in the approval was about the education system. But to be very frank, and maybe it's the same topic Najat has already touched, given the first answer to your question, there was not this, you know, a great knowledge about the importance of the very ambitious project of sustainability and 2030 agenda in my country then. We started with a very simple concept that became in some way, in my case, in my ministry, the driver of the process, which is inclusion. We try to, you know, Italy is a very long country, right? There's very, very different contexts that you can see. And from the south to the north, you can also in the school system, harsh differences and the inequalities. And starting from them and starting to give this message that the school system can be a real driver of a more inclusive society. If we can develop the right policies, we could introduce cultural sustainability also in the education system and between specialists and people who are in charge for education. And I think that what we should like to do, and now this is maybe the current position I have that can help me to see and also to suggest to my successors or in other countries in Europe more than in developing countries, is to be to open a bit the school system, because sometimes you know, teachers, we must be very frank, and all educators at national level are more concentrated on specific issues which has to do with their daily life, and not able, or they maybe they don't have the chance, the opportunity to enlarge, no, to have a more comprehensive vision of the great opportunities that a better education system can give to the country, to children, also to make a more inclusive and more equal society. So I think that this is my you know, my suggestion. Try to open. What did you mean? It means, for instance, give to children the opportunity to have a school to work scheme, and not to be only in the classroom, no, as you know, listening to teachers, and not having the opportunity to see what's happening in the same time outside the building, and involve families in the process more than they are. And there are some tools we can use, and a minister have the power. We must say that you have the power to increase this process. But as a starting point, I should say that there is you know, really a gap, as you said, between the international debate and what at national level you have to face, you have to develop, and you have to deliver in a very short time. So maybe yes, it's also the international organizations, by the way, must be a better work just to involve countries to talk about these issues.
Yes. Interesting insights for the position you're now holding.
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you. Najat?
Oui, enfin, moi je suis assez d'accord.
Well, I must say I agree with Stefania. Because in France too, actually, we're kind of disappointed when you think about it. We're kind of disappointed when we see how the SDGs are little known from the public at large. I mean, I know them. I'm familiar with them, of course, because this is my bread and butter, and I hear about them here, there, and everywhere internationally. I've traveled to many countries, and particularly in Africa. And I know that SDGs are better known and better mastered by the locals, and that the civil society have hampered them because it's a way of bringing empowerment. This is something that is greater than we are. And let's say when we're talking about education, access to water, or gender equality, these are things that are part of the SDGs in our countries, and in the field of education in particular. This is seen like something so national. Education is considered something very local, and all the discussions and passionate discussions, all the polemics, they go. I mean, they're all about our country and local. This is what makes the discussion all the less interesting, because we don't exchange with others. We as minister, we try and fly higher, and we try and bring this into the public discussion, say, okay, let's compare things and let's see how others do things. But this is not what happens, and it's not what observers see. So I'm very sorry to be slightly negative in my answer to your question, but I must say this didn't help that much. On the other hand, if we look at SDGs without calling them that, quote unquote, I would say yes, most certainly sustainable development as such, as an issue including global warming and all that, is more and more, is something that people are more and more aware about, and certainly school children are. Citizenship is something, civil responsibility is something that they're more aware with. Gender equality is something they are familiar with, certainly more so than in the past. But every single time it's a real tour de force to try and give them more importance, because you constantly faced with a discussion between those who say, okay, schools need to be more modern, and the school in the 21st century has to provide more tools to pupils. And then the others, on the other hand, say, no, that what is important is the same disciplines, the same issues, and what you dedicate, the time you dedicate to teaching them about sustainable development is something that you'll have to take away from maths or French or you name it. So the discussion is ongoing and pretty empty, and it takes up a lot of time and leads us to nothing. So I hope you are convinced thereof in this room. When we work when you work on sustainable development, you still have to use math and the language and everything else. So it's a subject matter that will be crucial in the future and still involves other subject matters.
We'll turn now to have each of the ministers speak for a period about a signature reform. It's of their choosing, something that they recall fondly or otherwise from their time in office. And so we're going to first start with Stefania Giannini.
Yes, about the reform, you were asking me which are the main, the main issues we try to develop. It was a very ambitious project. I should say now, maybe too much. I mean, because no, really, in education there is another things that you have to take into consideration when you plan something, when you want to have some results, very concrete results. That it's a field where you need time to see the consequence and the impact of your actions, and politics cannot wait. That's to summarize. It's unfortunately like this. So our ambitious project was about three main to summarize levels: teachers, students, and the school environment. So we should say the pillars of the education, learning and teaching process. About teachers, we didn't have in my country, maybe you would be surprised, but a permanent training process for them. And that's what we introduced as a compulsory one. And I'm proud to fight a bit also with teachers' unions about it, because the quality of teaching depends strongly on motivation, on the way teachers can work and can be, engaged in the process, but it depends also on the opportunity they have to refresh their knowledge. Knowledge now is not something which is in a static way, what you learned at university time, and then it's okay for the rest of life. It's a lifelong learning, as you say, in the intonation with the language you use. Also at UNESCO, the European level, it's a process, a never-ending process. And many countries, for sure in Italy, until this reform, teachers have the opportunity to do it like this, based on their willing, they find also the money to do that, because if you want to refresh your knowledge, if you want to be trained very well, you must go in some specific contest conferences and something, and you don't have sometimes the opportunity, the money, and the system which can help. So we did something like this. And the second point, and this was in some way accepted at the end of the day, but the second point, I should say, provoked a very strong reaction from the union system, which was a strike, a general strike at country level. And it was about, I should say, a more merit-based career for teachers. We introduced a national evaluation assessment system. We didn't have something like this. And I don't know, maybe we must also be very humble and say what didn't work, what mistakes we did, because maybe we did some mistakes. And I think the biggest one, we didn't, we were not so able to talk and explain the importance of this change, which is not simply, you put a national agency which can help you to evaluate your own work and to see the gaps, and to see how can you reinforce your position and your role in the classroom also, and then you'll be more satisfied of the work you do. We didn't do it. As a matter of fact, I must say that we will not be able to do that, and I think that this is one of the failure point of the reform. As far for students, I think that two main issues I'm proud to being able to introduce in the system. They were not there. The first one, a more dynamic process. We called it a national plan for digitalization. We shared also, you remember, Najat? Yeah, there's, a bit of the procedures and everything. But I want to say it's not computer science for children. It's something more ambitious. It's, try to make teachers first and students later able to use technologies, not like something which is different from their learning process, but which is essential part of it. And a very good, very, very successful campaign was coding in the primary school. We reached 1.5 million students in the country, which is a lot in 3 years. And this is something I'm sure will remain, because when you do like this, you open the school to the future, and it's something which can remain. And the third point, the last one, was something very, very strongly discussed also in the public debate. I already mentioned it, is the so-called school to work scheme. We didn't have vocational training experience for all students in the country, something very, very small for in the technical high schools, but we enlarged the process, and we made it compulsory for all students in the high school in the third last years. And this is not simply, to combine working and vocational course, working and learning, but it's a new model, also a new paradigm, just to see that theory and practice are something that go together, and you can, in this case, I should say, we try to open the school to society. So if I can summarize the reform in a word, I should say that we try to open our school system, because I think that this is maybe the more important effort we can do at political level, especially in these times. And I think that we succeeded half enough, because, then they change a lot of things, as sometimes happens everywhere. But in some way, we were not so able to translate this message in a more effective way, and
Okay. Could you say a bit more? Could you say a bit more about the school to work? Did it take the form of internships, or I understood that there was some mandatory vocational training in secondary level, etc.
Yeah.
And was there pushback from which groups?
It was for all students in the high.
C'était pour tous les élèves dans le système de l'enseignement supérieur, du lycée, pardon, ce que nous appelons les lycées en France.
We usually learn in the classroom ancient languages like Latin and Greek, and they're not absolutely far from the job market before years like this, before the end of the high school and before going to university, and in many cases after the university process, they started to see what's happening outside the classroom. And we introduced, if I remember well, yes, for 200 hours, compulsory hours a year, in order to have the combination of these two dimensions. And, every school had a tutor who was in charge to involve teachers in this new activity. And the companies, but also institutions, public institutions. Just to mention one very good example, a very good project I remember with Pompeii, the site, the archaeological site. 15 schools in the region, in the area, were involved in the process of rethinking and rebuilding all the communication and, you know, the organizers' project of hosting tourists and something. So there was something very, very close also to some dimensions like cultural heritage, like in this case, or but which was the reaction by some parts of the public debate was against this experience. Oh, you know, you send children to work and you don't pay them. That's just to summarize, no? Just to see that. And we know that in Europe we have countries, such as Switzerland, for instance, we were inspired by that model. Germany, who have a very, very well structured system, which can also help students to be better orientated for their later choices, no, at university level. This is one of the main purposes we had. So students were happy, teachers so-and-so, and the most part of public debate was against, to summarize. And this is exactly was, no, I think Najat you know, as a principal mentioned before.
And you mentioned that you wish you'd been more successful in communicating to the public, etc. And the strike was of teachers or of
teachers sure.
Strike, yes, because of all the changes in the teacher service. And in retrospect, do you know what the view of the teacher unions is now of that reform?
You know, no, we had a long discussion after the strike. We also rebuilt a bit, no, the partnership with the government and also with the ministry and the minister herself. But you know, in my experience, I must be very frank, the teachers' unions are often very, very conservative part of the society, because they prefer to conserve the model that is still running and not to, because it's risky, no? To change, every change has a risk and you must take into consideration. And I think that also, you know, starting with a stronger relationship, a continuous and permanent discussion with them. At the end of the day, they thought that this reform, especially about teachers and merit-based career, and something which they, before the reform, they control and they had in their hands. Sorry, this is power. We must use the right words, no? In politics, power is something very important, and also in our daily life. And they prefer to keep their power in their hands. And
yeah, I understand. But you also talked about providing professional development opportunities, the importance
yes.
of continuous development for teachers. Did that not help win them over a bit, or?
It helped through the years, but this is at the end of the day, the same problem we discussed before. If you don't so much time, no, to explain, to develop, to implement the reform, you don't have the opportunity, no, to demonstrate. You see, we started from there, and now we are here, and you see that there is a benefit for also for the category, no, you want to protect. But what can I say? I don't know if it, because I'm no more minister in my country, but when I finish my mandate, and also nowadays somebody recognized me. Oh, Giannini, yes, you're the minister. You know, you did like this, and also teachers recognize now that something was good, and they had the, you know, they have an open system, no, more than it was in the past. But at that time, there is a, you know, a third dimension we didn't mention, not yet here in this debate, and is the press. The press is something that Najat knows better than me, it's a very, very crucial actor in the process, because they can, they can use some language, they can provoke a misunderstanding about everything. And we must consider that not simply families and students, but also teachers, the most part of time, how can they know about their minister? Not because they are encountered. No, in my country, we have 1 million and something teachers in the public system. So it's something that, of course, you can reach by means of public communication. And the communication, sometimes it's not easy to be driven, no, in a positive way. I mean, not just, telling that you are doing that, and you can't not say that we are doing something else, but it happens like this, no?
So these are common tensions for ministers of education, I think, with teacher unions, with the press, at the same time that you're hoping to bring along the public, the families, the children, the families, the teachers. So you're in a difficult situation trying to manage that, even if in the long term it leads to improved quality.
Yes. But it's also amazing, right? Because you understand. No, I don't want to but just to say that, just to think, we also tried, just to say a bit about it, the starting point of this reform, the process was a public consultation, online. And do you remember? You remember we discussed a bit? Yeah. They said, I don't know if it's true, but it's been the largest public consultation on public policy in Europe. We reached 1.8 million citizens who replied to our questions. Just to give a very concrete example, do you think it's good to have mandatory training, teachers training, or not? No, something like this. So we thought that it was a very open way to start with the public debate about the education system and how could it better than it was. But at the end of the day, when you change the system in very concrete terms, then there are some other forces that can react, no? And this is the forces who have in their hands some power, and they want to demonstrate that their power is higher than the government can have. This is my.
Thank you. Thank you. That's very, very interesting. I'd like to turn to Najat to share with us some, as you wish.
Okay, thank you very much. Mais si je peux d'abord rebondir sur les...
Thank you very much. But first, I would like to react to what Stefania said, and then I will answer the questions. First of all, it's a bit funny because a few weeks ago, I just met a researcher preparing a doctorate and a thesis on the education policies, and I asked him, tell me a little bit about what you're doing, how you're studying this. He said, well, I've identified all the players in education policies, and then I go and visit them one after the other. So this is the reason why I came to see you as a former minister. And I said, fine, who are the players you have identified? And he said, well, of course, the education administration, the trade union, the parents, students' parents, and I can't remember what other players. And no, that's all actually. And I looked at him and said, what about the press? And that's why I'm telling you this story, because I really agree with you 100%. Not taking into account the role of the press, particularly in discussions around education, well, you miss something, because having that is very important. This brings me back to my introduction when I say there is a gap between the complexity of the challenges and the poor quality of the public discussions. And this poor quality of public discussions is not due to the citizens citizens, because the citizens are not responsible, and citizens work, they have a family, they don't have the time to go and read all the different letters and the circular letters, but it is due to those who convey this information. Who are the ones conveying information? There are three players, actually. When these citizens are themselves teachers, they have their trade union organizations, because what I have discovered, and I don't know whether it was the same for you, Stefania, but I think I was probably very naive at the time, because I thought that teachers, for instance, would read the content of the reforms before they started discussing or criticizing, knowing that when we implement a reform, it's not confidential. It's written down with words. It's somewhere. It's on the internet, the website of the ministry. It gives rise to a consultation. The papers exist, so the paper exists. And I naively thought that the teachers, since they were the first ones to be concerned, would read the document. Not at all. They just look at the social networks. They ask their trade union organizations when they belong to a trade union to inform them when this is the case. And they also watch the news on TV. And if wider observers like the media, the press, decide either on a voluntary basis or militant basis to present, to mislead people, it's not just a public opinion, but the teachers themselves will have the wrong information, and they would therefore criticize the content without knowing what is there. And we don't only have the militant media, because I fully agree with Stefania when she said that when you start criticizing the tough issues or hard issues, and education is something very hard, because it tells you about the position of your children in the coming years. Your children are competing with other people's children. We can all just try to behave as if everybody was nice and kind, and that education is an important value. But some people consider that a system, an elite system, where being successful in education is only for just the elite, is something that is beneficial for them, because they know that their children will have a better life than the children of their neighbors. And then you have other people who are naive dreamers like me, who consider that this is not the case, and that the public authorities, the mission of the public authorities was to make sure that the children are all on an equal footing, and that all of them can succeed. People who generally can make themselves heard in the media and impose their point of view are those who defend and support their own interests and those of their children, as opposed to other people's children. And that's what they say, because when they write, of course, they say that they're writing or expressing themselves in the highest interest of all the children, which is not true. So in the press, you have the militant press, and not of all everybody in the press is an activist or a militant, but there are people also who are not really interested in this by this topic, and it doesn't bother them to just report things by just modifying the truth, reporting a truncated version of the truth. And when you look at the reform, which is so much criticized, and if you look at the countries, the neighboring countries who have implemented the same reform, it was very successful. They never say anything about that. But of course, you have a minority in the press. But as I said, it's a minority press, and the citizens don't really listen to that press, unfortunately, even though they say the truth. So just to tell you about my discussion with this a student preparing this doctoral student, the press is a major player. And to that, you have to add the trade union organizations. I've learned to get to know them. You can't consider that they're all the same, because you have people who are more conservatives, other more progressive, and the trade union organizations define them as belonging to a varied landscape. To a variable landscape, sorry. And without trying to be unpleasant, I remember that when I started working in the ministry, the very first days I was just, everything was new for me in my office. And all of a sudden I ended up with that much files, and I had to take decisions immediately. And I had to see 50 people a day, and it was really a problem if you couldn't see them. So 2 weeks later, I remember that I told someone in my team, in my cabinet, I said, well, I've seen many people, really many people, but sorry, when do you ever talk about the students? Because I personally, because you didn't ask me the question, but that's something, this question is something that I find really interesting. Because as a political person, I know that it is with education that a lot can be done, if not everything, but I'm personally passionate because I love children, and therefore I'm a bit scared because it's something that is very motivating. And I wanted to offer a better future to the children. And during these 2 weeks, I met a lot of people, a lot of trade union organizations, but I never, ever heard about children and students. Which is something quite important. I'm not saying that the topics trade unions discuss and the working conditions of the teachers are not serious. They are important. That's fine for them to discuss them. But I think that the student is not really very often at the center of the discussions. So therefore, when you implement a reform or you decide a reform, because the specific characteristics or the common points of our reforms for Stefania and myself is that these reforms really completely reshuffle the things. And my reform, the purpose of my reform was to completely modify the pedagogical practices of the teachers. So we turned things upside down. We told them it's not normal that every year we have 100 to 140,000 students who drop out of school without any competences, because usually they started dropping out in the lower secondary school. We know that this is where problems happen most of the time. I have figures, I don't have them all here, but we have had figures showing us that when students enter lower secondary school, students, or 1 student out of 8 did not really have a good knowledge of all the fundamentals. And 4 years later, it was 1 student out of 4, which means that the difficulties became even greater during these 4 years in lower secondary education. So there was a problem there in the education system. So one of the elements of our reform was to say, well, there is something that is not good for all the students, and that's the type of education we have, where the teacher speaks in front of 32 students, trying to pretend that all the students are at the same level, and some of them are not, and they simply don't stop listening, and 3 or 6 months later, you've lost them. They don't know how to react. And we have introduced a new pedagogical practice, which we called interdisciplinary practical education, i.e. there were moments during which the teachers would be working together. It was just like some sort of co-teaching on specific projects. We talked about the sustainable development earlier on. So rather than talking about physics, science, and geography to the students, well, it was decided that there would be a project, and I will, for instance, explain climate change, and we will use your knowledge and what I'm trying to teach you, and we will use all that for a project. We try to mobilize the students, and this is what we call the interdisciplinary practical classes. And this was part of the reform. But there we had to deal with some trade union organizations and even some teachers who were totally against this. Why? Well, simply because the student doesn't have to be at the heart of the reform. It's the teacher who is at the center. This is what authority is all about. Usually when things like that happen, they talk about authority. And secondly, well, I don't want to work with my with another teacher. Co-working is not so easy, and they considered that this was not really very pleasant for them when it's imposed upon them. And then I can't remember what was the third reason, but roughly speaking, when you look at, try to change the practice, this is where things become difficult and where you have to face very conservative trade unions. And I really can confirm that. And then the third player who should not be forgotten, and this is what I told the doctoral student, was the political opposition. I don't know whether you have ministers from other countries here in the room. Maybe some of them are listening to us, but you cannot do just as if the opposition does not exist and the opposition would be sometimes ready to use all the possibilities to discredit the ministers using fake news if need be. And if we don't understand that being the Minister of Education takes place in this context with fake news, then you just simply do not see something important. There are more fake news about some ministers more than about others. And I believe I was one of those about whom there were a lot of fake news. And I can tell you that nevertheless, it is something that exists everywhere. I'm just like you, Stefania. Our term during our mandate, there were too many reforms. We should draw lessons from that, actually. The problem is that as of 2012, we found ourselves in a context where education had gone through a lot because a lot of positions no more existed in education, that the results were really poor. And between 2000 and 2015, I just invite you to look at some of the results. And the students did not really properly had not properly learned the fundamentals, and that was the case in France. And this is the reason why education is a priority. This is the reason why we had decided to completely reshuffle the education system in schools. And for 5 years, we had decided that we would take things one by one. We have just redeveloped the training of teachers. It did exist in the past, but disappeared for 5 years, I think. So we decided that it was important to have that. And we had a 4-day school instead of 5 days, which means that French students had less teaching hours than the other students. And we decided that we would go back to a system with 5 days of schools. And this was very complicated because it was a complete change. We reformed priority education. We reformed lower secondary school. We reformed the curricula. We changed all the curriculum for the primary school, lower education schools, etc. And since we did a lot of things, well, the teachers had a lot they could criticize because they always had something they could criticize. And when I started the reform of the curriculum, which was very ambitious, because for the first time in our history in France, we thought we were going to rethink the content of the curriculum from the age of 6 up to the age of 15 at the same time. So it's the same group of people and teachers who were thinking about the content of the curriculum so that it be consistent, to make sure there's no overlapping, that what you've learned in one grade, you don't have to repeat it in another grade, etc. So we've done this work trying to modernize the learning system, and the opponents, when it came to criticizing that, it was always on the basis of fake news, but it did work. And we reviewed, for instance, the history curriculum, and the first fake news that came out was, they no more teach about the Christian religion, and they're not going to teach Islam. Why? It was just unbelievable. We're laughing today, but believe me, it hurts because this destroys your credibility for the other reforms you're carrying out at the same time, because you don't have too much time to answer all these criticisms, because you have to use your time for other purposes. So you had that kind of criticism, and you had, when we reformed the curriculum, one day we heard a fake news on, but that's just a scandal. Their new idea was to reform the spelling to make writing easier, and there would be no more accent circumflex. I don't know what this is. These things no more exist. The word onion would be written in a different way. That's a scandal. I one day heard that on the radio, and I said, what are they talking about? I'm the minister. I had the impression they were talking about someone else. What are they talking about? I never decided to reform the spelling. And I carried out other reforms, but not this one. And I said, what happened? Did I ever think about it? No. I never heard about it. This reform never existed. Never, ever did it exist. I can promise you it never existed. And believe me or not, when we looked at the opinion polls, what people discussed during lunchtime or in the evening, because you have opinion polls telling you what people discuss, for at least 2.5 months to 3 months, that was the number one topic discussed during dinners, reforming spelling to make it more simple. Why? Well, simply because the fact that it did not exist, the fact that I kept repeating it did not exist was not sufficient. It fueled the fake news because you had political opponents who repeated that. They had understood that it worked. And the press related that and did not actually try to tell people, the public, that it was not true. Sorry for taking too long, but I was saying that I have the feeling that I was the one of those about whom you heard a lot of fake news. But one day I met my counterpart, my Portuguese counterpart, who was a young minister, a progressive minister of national education. We were supposed to hold the conference the next day, and we had dinner together. And I told him this story about the changing the spelling, etc., because I was really in the middle of that. And I said, well, I can't believe what happens to me. So he put his fork down and he said, I can't believe you. I said, I can swear. He says, I can't believe you, but the same thing happened to me. Exactly the same thing. I was also accused for weeks and weeks to try to reform the spelling to make it more simple, something which I never did. And I said, well, that's really interesting. And that's the reason why I have decided to work in international research in the private sector, because what I'm interested in is that everything we believe to be spontaneous, to be a real coincidence, because you see the same type of trials in different countries. Actually, there's nothing spontaneous there. There's no coincidence. All this is what thought, and there are people who think about it, and some of the decision tools bother people, and I don't know where things are decided, but it's not normal that the same arguments are used in different countries. And to talk about gender equality, I had experienced the same thing in education, and I can tell you that I remember that in France, when we wanted to introduce equality, gender equality, and this was a program, a curriculum I had introduced at the same time. I was a minister for women's rights, and I prepared that with my colleague, and it was just experimental, but it was a great program. It was a program which allowed teachers, the one who wanted to take part to this program, teachers in primary education, to better measure the differences between boys and girls and in their interactions with boys and girls, to see how the unconscious stereotype had an impact on the education they offered to boys and girls, and to give them tools to learn, to teach young boys or young girls that they can have the same type of ambitions, etc., and that you don't have to just act according to the stereotypes. So this program's called ABC de l'égalité, when it became public, led to huge polemic in France. I see just people nodding, with, of course, groups of people opposed to the program, pretending that there would be no more differences between the genders, and that it would teach all children that they could become homosexuals.
So there was a lot of controversy of it. So the opponents basically called that the gender theory. That's what they called it, the gender theory. It's about negating the difference between boys and girls. And a few years down the line, In Colombia, you remember that there was the peace agreement with FARC, and there was a referendum in Colombia. And I remember that President François Hollande went to Colombia when the referendum was about to be held. And the referendum was rejected by the population. When he came back, he said, you know, that what was the main argument on the basis of which the referendum was rejected? I said, no, well, I don't know. Were they too rough on women? No, it was the gender theory. Really? Yes, it's exactly the same arguments that we used in certain, there was a sentence that said, we will ensure gender equality. And the fact that you're using the word gender means that we are actually going towards teaching homosexuality in school and negating the differences between boys and girls. So the same arguments were used in Colombia as well. So when you see that, when I see this, forward-looking politicians should basically take all these arguments and see how they're playing out in different societies.
Sur ce sujet parce que oui, c'est vraiment intéressant de voir.
Yes, it's interesting to see the dynamics. The different countries are different, but the arguments are basically pretty much the same. The political context is different. But I also would like to say to Najat that I also had, you see, the same experience in Italy. It was about the information. You actually invited two new ministers, naive ministers, and there's a problem. I wanted to talk about the question of fake news. I was actually put through the same problem. Two specific examples. The first one is on the gender theory, and I'm extremely glad and proud that I actually introduced this reform in Italy. And there was a specific article that says that all students must be informed about the violence in youth circles and have some kind of, so we talked about youth violence basically. So this word was taken and in Italy, in the Italian newspapers, the Italian dailies, broadsheet newspapers. So the Renzi government has introduced the theory, the gender theory in Italy. And you can pretty much imagine the reaction of the Catholic community, the conservative community, the Vatican. So this is something that's going to change the identity. And this was absolutely nothing to do with the original intention I had. Then there was this disinformation campaign that ensued and a lot of fake news. And there was basically the social networks adding fuel to the fire. The position and the role of the school principal also was strengthened. We gave the school principals, the head teacher, more responsibilities. That was the reform. And I was called, what did you do? What kind of reform have you made? In the school benches. You had the good schools, so to speak, and the school principal was considered to be the cop, the sheriff. So they were considered to be the policemen with guns.
Oui, la gendarme. Oui.
So that was the title of the newspaper heading. School principal is the police officer in the school. So you see, it was extremely difficult to contain this public debate because this was put in headlines and completely stripped of its context.
My personal view about this issue, I think that it's really something that we have to take into account. Also as international organization, if you can say something about my current position, we have a lot of responsibility to try to disseminate a culture of quality education, sustainability all over the world. There are a lot of difference from developing countries to advanced countries, but the issue is the same. We have a planet we have to preserve. We have a cultural heritage, and we must be, aware that we have to transmit identity, knowledge about it. But we must first choose the right language to be able to reach people directly. A simple message that everybody can understand. And sometimes, Najat, I don't know if it's your case, for me it's absolutely like this. Also as politicians, we are not, we don't have the opportunity, I don't know, to use this kind of language, because there are a lot of, different levels of, that's the first. And this is up to us. This is up to us as international public officers and passionate, how can I say, champions of education that you'd like to be. And it's up to us as ministers or members of different parliaments. But there is another issue which is not in our hands, unfortunately, I think, is that there is, how can I say, press, but it's not only magazines and social networks, everything, which are really, really the most difficult. If I should say, which has been the most difficult and also painful thing. I remember about this very, very intensive and some way 3 amazing years of my life is the relationship with press. Because I was in a state of continuously, anxious about what they are going to write, what they are going to understand, what they are going to think about. Also because it's like this: you say something, you write something, you do something, and this something becomes magically something else, and people start to think, oh, le directeur jeune d'art. Avec le... Yeah, no. We are in peace. We are not... You're peace builders,
Yes, indeed.
Can I just react on juste sur une chose que tu as dit?
Oui.
One thing on what you just said. You're right. You really have to recognize that. And I just said that I'm not actually blaming the citizen. Definitely not on the citizen. Citizens, I can understand. Lack of information, fake information, hasty judgments, and everything. But I have to recognize that we as politicians, irrespective of our intentions, we really don't have the choice, especially when it comes to language and vocabulary. I really like to archive the speeches I would give out, and I've actually kept all of them on my blog. And sometimes if I have to prepare something, I would refer back to a speech that I've made as the education minister. Now, of course, this is not always true. When I talk to students, I use different vocabulary, but sometimes I really feel that in political speeches, we use expressions that cannot be understood by the layman. And yet, these are concepts which are clear, talking about pedagogical differentiation, something like that. It's a barbaric term, but I don't really think that parents understand what that means. And we feel that we've actually got a message across, but it's not the case. So again, I think you're absolutely right with respect to language. We really need to have an external body. Why not a foundation or an international organization? They should come and help us, because one of the reasons why the public is basically missing out on the real challenges is because they do not have the vocabulary to basically understand the challenges. And we also have to be very careful and use language that is understood by one and all.
Questions for each other, or there's been quite a lot of good exchange between the two of you.
Yeah, we already.
So many common themes that you've experienced.
Voilà.
Non, j'ai une question parce qu'en vérité, je ne sais pas, Stefania, c'est est-ce que...
Stefania, I don't know, I've got a question for you. You left office in 2016, end of 2016, and your successor was a different, but you see, your direct successor is someone who actually pursued your policy, whereas I have a direct successor, who's actually breaking away from my policy. He's actually undoing everything I did. So again, you spent time convincing people, and then someone who comes and does the exact opposite and undoes everything. So again, a 4-day week to a 5-day week, and again, changes, very drastic changes. Well, in my case, there was some kind of continuity, which was not there in your case. We had this political continuity as well with the change in government, but after the political elections this year, we don't know. And the new one has actually done the same thing. So again, your good school reform was undone, including teacher training as well. Well, on teacher training, let me say that he was quite subtle. He did not basically do away with teachers training. It's good to say that all teachers in our country are trained, and they have the possibility of also doing refresher courses and everything. But he again took the gender theory up, and he said that there's a 40 million euros devoted to this aspect, and he says that we need to do teacher training, but not with this money. It's the school that needs to organize the training. So again, my question, Najat.
Just, we can say, no? Entre nous. Il y a seulement 8.
But so again, just between us.
Non,
mais smart lady,
évidemment que la politique, ça...
Yes, I do miss politics. but I do not regret my choices, because sometimes it's good to have some hindsight and see what we could have done better and what we can do better in the future. You see, it's not about judging anything or anyone. I'm in the education sector, and I basically am looking into something that you will like. It's the perception of cognitive bias, because this is why I talked about the vocabulary. When I look at cognitive studies, I really am looking at concepts such as prejudice, and then all the information is going to be cast in a particular light. You see, your brain is not even going to listen to anything else, the cognitive bias that I'm talking about. So I haven't actually retained the name of each and every bias, but we only retain sometimes the last piece of information and forget the rest. So you see, we understand why people don't recontextualize things. So when you understand all these cognitive bias, you can say that there will be ways of better communicating in the future. But again, you have to actually put in so much of energy, and we already we already doing it anyway. We're at least starting to.
You've talked a lot about the politics, and I'm wondering if I'd like to ask a question that's more about the policy making process. And I am fearful of, given your experiences as you've expressed, of the answer to this. But to what extent were you able to use data when you were a minister? Were you able to use evidence analysis, evaluation to help inform the design of policies? And did you also find that it got distorted?
Yeah. Yes, in my case, yes, we used two different kind of data. I should say the more internal one, at ministry level. And I remember that it was really, really very hard to collect homogeneous and well-structured set of data, because I don't know the situation in France, but in Italy, it's not so. It's not yet a data-based system. The policy making, and we believe that it is very important dimension. So we build with a very young team I had, keeping people from researchers from the UK, we are young researchers, Italian, we have experience there, and from the European Commission, and we started to build a good set of data just about students, about everything, and it's something which is already there. But the most useful dimension about data was the external one, and it came mostly, sorry to say, from OECD and the European Commission. UNESCO was a bit absent in my experience, and that's one of the reasons why I try to to change. Yes, to also because of maybe UNESCO in Europe is more culture than education. No, we have this kind of in terms of perception. So I discovered UNESCO as minister a bit later, and it was a fantastic meeting about sustainability, because we are organizing. We hope to organize. Then there was another government did it. The G7 in my country. You remember, Najat, we are together in Japan. Yes. And, UNESCO was there because there was a strong commitment, and it's still there, and it will be stronger and stronger about sustainability and everything. But in terms of data, OECD and the European Commission were our our counterparts. And, I think that the approach we used was strongly data-based.
Yeah. Thank you. And you, Najat?
Well, to be honest, as a minister, we use data a lot. We know all the data sets that exist. We've done assessment of external data, And also, internally, we had a great assessment and evaluation mechanism. So the question is not about the use of data by public authorities. If they want to do it, we wanted to do it, we will do it. It can be done. It's the real subject is the immature public debate and the stakeholders and their attitude towards the data. Let me give you two examples. First of all, you can sometimes be irritated when you see that even today in France, when a pizza classification is going to come, the again, people are going to criticize the reform. Pizza is for 15 years old, and the reform is actually completely different. It talked about something else. So you see, we basically, when you're a serious politician, it's quite irritating. It's really hard to explain to journalists and the public opinion that you just have to actually take all this with a pinch of salt. And if you want to take PISA results, do it seriously, do it the right way. The second example, even internal data, when I became the minister, one of the objectives was to bring down the dropouts in school. So we had about 140,000 in 2012. And honestly, I was the minister for 3 years. And for me, this was one of my priority objectives. I've done so many things on this subject, including creating experimental schools for remedial classes, for giving students certain right to go back to school. The ones who've dropped out and everything have scholarships for such students. So I've done a lot of work. But at the end of the day, we were about 80,000. We did bring the figures down, from 140,000 to 80,000 between 2012 and 2017. But what is unbearable, and this is precisely why I'm against the poor quality of public debate, you can actually look at the latest document on the subject of school dropouts. So many articles have been written. You will see that the figure that is quoted is 140,000. So again, we have these figures, but these figures are never quoted. It's just because we want to complain about the education, and we always use figures that are convenient to cast us in poor light. So again, it's really very immature, the public data. So it's a public debate. It's not more of a data problem, it's the public debate.
I know the audience has been sending in many questions. And so I'm going to turn to Estelle to ask a few questions from the online and audience, as well as from the audience here. Go ahead, Estelle.
Thank you, Sue. Indeed, we have received a lot of questions. I will start by some questions about the issues of communication and fake news. Online, in the room, I think there's a lot of questions regarding that. Online, I may say that some comments say that press is also very important for transparency and to inform transparency about the education policy. And I think that's also something they wanted to express very strongly. But in terms of questions, some question for Najat. Ce problème de communication.
This communication problem, does it not affect all ministers and all politicians who are at the government? And what's the solution? Is it not the role of the communications department of the ministry to try and combat this problem of fake news? Several questions on communication problems with specific stakeholders like teachers. how to rebuild the bond between the educational administration and the teachers. Again, there are lots of strikes as well in the education field. And what would be the way to rebuild that bond? First of all, your introductory remarks. Yes, the press is also there for transparency. And I really hope you haven't misconstrued what I said. I really like the press, and press for me is so valuable that I'm sorry, the minister is not audible. Could you please ask her to speak into the mic? I can't hear her. Thank you so much. Yes, now it's much better. Yes, please. Great. So I was just saying, just to come back to the introductory remark, I really do not want you to misconstrue my comments. The press is extremely precious in our democratic system, and it's quite normal that we should actually ask the press to have a neutral opinion and inform the public the way it should. Now, with regards to your first question, you were saying that this fake news and disinformation, does it not affect other ministries as well? The problem is education is a different topic altogether. And I'll tell you why. This is an extremely serious issue, but it is not perceived as a serious issue. For instance, when you compare with the health ministry, people consider that health is an extremely serious subject. But they also consider that there are health specialists who know better than them. So they could be perhaps in disagreement with the health policy, but when they actually hear a health specialist telling them it's good for your health, so it's really important, so people say that, well, they know better than me, and I cannot call into question their legitimacy, their credibility. But the major problem in education, and I can understand the teachers because I've actually experienced what teachers experience, the expertise, you see, of educational stakeholders is not recognized. Their legitimacy is not recognized. And this is precisely why we have stupid, absolutely stupid discussions. When we change the school syllabus at some point of time, there was technical vocabulary that was changing. Instead of, for instance, when you're doing certain grammatical concepts, we were calling it as predicate, the subject and the predicate. But again, let me tell you, everyone, that I did not wake up saying that I'm going to invent the notion of predicate. This was something that already existed. It was a scientific concept, and it actually goes back to a very long time. But again, this was actually thought by people who were intelligent, who knew what they were doing. And in the cognitive process of children, it's really important to understand the composition of the sentence before even coming to understanding the function of each word. And that was the basic idea. This notion of predicate, you have so many political observers, editorialists as well, who have absolutely no idea. They have no scientific legitimacy, and they started criticizing it. They said it's rubbish. This is something like we don't understand. And they were basically denying the teachers the right to have a professional vocabulary. You could accept this for other jobs like doctors. The plumbers have their own jargon, but teachers don't have the right. And I think that we don't say this very often, but this is the core, the bone of contention, the crux of the problem. Many people I think 65 to 75 people think they know what to do with education, and you just, keep going round in circles. So unlike other sectors and other ministries, education is suffering because of this problem, and there could be a controversy coming in through any door and could actually take up unbelievable proportions. It's about convincing public debate, and you sometimes have, women are looked at in a different way, especially when it's a woman minister. People say that, oh, there's a mad woman sitting there. Again, and if you see when we actually say that no, this is not a right critique, they say that you're just being sexist. Anyway, basically, it's women who move things, are extremely are easy targets for violence, basically.
The second question was, well, no, now that we have understood there's communication problems, major problems, how do we manage them? Well, let me tell you, if I were to be a minister again tomorrow, I would consider communication, widely speaking, i.e. communication covering media, social network, cognitive life, etc., as a very, very serious issue. And I will dedicate time, people, money, and I would really have a team working on that and day and night, because actually it's really a major issue. Unfortunately, it's useless to act if you're not able to make yourself understood by people and make sure that people will follow you. And it so happens that last year I attended an event where in the evening where we had a dinner, and I was sitting next to the former Haitian prime minister, and we exchanged views on our experience. And he told me, well, that he also was the target of a certain number of fake news on the social networks, etc., while he was the prime minister. And he told me something which I found really interesting. He said, well, after a while, it really made me angry. And I just asked the data scientist to come. And I asked him to come and spend 2 or 3 weeks with my team, with my cabinet. And I asked him to check for me and to identify where these tweets and comments on the web came from. Because my intuition was that this was not spontaneous. And he said that for 3 weeks, this person took every tweet, every message, and tried to find out where they came from. And she was able then to tell me that my intuition was right. I.e. that there is a lot of things that have been completely constructed, and there are forces which go against your changes because they're supporting your interests, but they will simply say that they're a citizen who doesn't like your tie, for instance, or they just start discrediting you about using things that seem very innocent. But this kind of things, you have to dedicate time to that. It's not pleasant, but that's the way we should act with communication and take communication seriously. I can't remember the last point. Yes, okay, the relationship. Yes, the teachers, well, here again, let me try to be very balanced, because I talked about the conservatism and the fact that there are people who don't want to change their pedagogical practices. Let me just say that I'm in a capacity, after my experience as a minister, that being a teacher is one of the most difficult jobs, honestly. And I must say that they need a lot of energy. They need to have many different competences and capacities to be a teacher and a good teacher. And they have to just deal with discipline, but at the same time, they have to create, to make sure students are interested. They have to be like an actor. They have just to attract the attention of these 35 students sitting there. And I'm really impressed, and I must say that it's a very difficult job. And from that point of view, I must say I agree in saying that we have to make their task easier, and sometimes they don't have the feeling that they are treated as they should be treated. I've tried at the end of my term and I don't think that this was continued. I think it is very important to question, to dispute the inspection systems in France, because it is not very pleasant for the teachers, because you have people who come to check what the teachers do. It's very condescending vis-a-vis the teachers. And what I tried to do was to turn this system into a system supporting the teachers, where like a consulting system. Teachers can go and see them, and maybe in the end they can go to just suggest that maybe the teacher needs more training without punishing them. I think we have to go a bit further into that, and this is what will make teachers more comfortable, because very often they have the impression that you're asking them to give you the moon, but at the same time you see them as children.
Maybe there's many questions also on more international issues. I think you have answered some of the questions about PISA and how PISA results could inform or influence the national education policy. I think I would like, for the few minutes, maybe to raise questions that has not been discussed yet. The issues of inclusive education, I think that was one of the main policy you mentioned. What would be your, try to translate that, what would be the solutions to have a more inclusive education within the two countries? And there's also the issues of migrants, children coming from refugees. Do you think Italy and France and European nations and countries tackle the issue correctly?
Yes, may I say very, very short terms, try to summarize in the same answer the two questions you put on the table, because they're very close and linked. I should say that coming in this position at UNESCO, one of the main can I say the most important, the most relevant thing I thought UNESCO should do in the near future is working about inclusion in terms of also, but as a very, very big priority, of right education for displaced people, for people on the move, for people who are forced to move from their country, their region, for very many different reasons. Because in my opinion, it's not simply one of the many issues we have at global level. It's maybe the issue, because nowadays, it's a question of, really try to build a global society which should be more grounded on universal values. No? The president of this country some days ago thought about the distinction between patriotism and nationalism. I should say that the same difference I see between universalism and globalism, right? Universalism is the new dimension we have to improve and we have to reach by means of a more integrated society. What does it mean? It means that we must be able to know a bit more each other, cultures, religions, beliefs, languages, and by means of that, maybe to be, I don't want to say tolerant, it's a word I don't like so much, but to be open. Thank you. That's the word I love so much, to be open. That means to offer ourselves as a part of a different identity to our friends, independently on the color of their skin and everything which can, their religion and something. And which is the main infrastructure we have in our hands to build this kind of universal and integrated society. It's education. It's education that means, in a very concrete way, to have teachers who can, learn a bit more about these issues and be able to transmit their passion about it. Because I'm sure that I think in every country, the most part of teachers, also because they live in a classroom, I should say in my country, sometimes and not simply in the big cities, but also in the, you know, you know that in Italy, as in France, no, you have the mid-size and small-size cities, but you can find communities where you find in the same class between 10 and 20 different mother tongues for 40% or 30% of foreign students, right? But these foreign students, maybe the second generation of migrants, they come back to their family and they don't speak the hosting country language. Just to mention a very concrete topic I faced, and I also tried, also as a professor in my university, but more than this as minister, to find some new solutions, right? So I think that migration, education for migration, it's really, really one of the key issues we have to face. And I should say, not to promote my new house, but UNESCO really, really is the house, is the right place in the world where we can discuss, we can think about, we can give guidelines about this topic. It's a huge responsibility. It's not an easy task, for sure. Otherwise, I should be naive the second time. It's becoming a bit worried. But, you know, it's something we can do. But if you ask me what is inclusion in a broader, comprehensive way, it's about gender, no? Because in the left, outside of this classroom, more or less half the world population, or you lose as a dropout process on the way. It's the contrary of inclusion, right? When you have you don't have an open access to university system, because we don't talk so much about higher education. But please don't forget the higher education is really the new step we have to take into account. We have to work about, no? Because the future of countries, the way they can develop a better society will depend, in my opinion, more and more on the best universities they will have. And to have a good university doesn't mean simply to have, as Najat, I think, mentioned before, the elite going there, no? And you know, to create the new elite for the future. But it's more than this, to give the same opportunity to, of course, to students who have a talent to spend in a more theoretical approach and training than vocational training or something like this, which is a very good option too. So inclusion means open once again the system and to be aware of the you know, the new needs that we have as citizens of a really universal world. And maybe this is also in terms of language, no? Because when we talk about a global citizenship, no, it's quite popular topic. I believe so much that you have to try to disseminate a culture of global citizenship. But in some countries, maybe you know that global, when you say global, there is a reaction which is not always so positive. And there is some reasons why, right? Because global became more and more the way to, as nationalism, no? Nationalism is, I defend my own, and this is my territory, you are outside, and I don't want to have anything to do with you. And, you know, globalization sometimes is we put everything together, but what is more important is not that we have at the same level and we develop a better society together, but it's more important that we can, yes, that's the keywords. Thank you so much, Najat. Competition versus cooperation. So we must competitive strongly, I should say also aggressive, in a competition against ignorance, against poverty, against inequalities, all these kind of issues. And we must cooperate in the sense that we are, you know, human beings, and we share universal values. And this is for me inclusion.
Thank you. We have run out of time.
We have a reception?
We have a reception, yes. Yes.
You're in France, no?
Would you please join me in thanking our dear guests today? let me also express thanks to our interpreters and to the whole IEP team that was behind this event. Michaela, Martin, thank you very much, but also our information services team. Thank you very much. Thank you. So now, don't forget this seminar is recorded. The video will be available on IEP's YouTube channel, and you are welcome. You're invited to watch our whole playlist. But right now, we invite you upstairs to please join us in having a cocktail. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sue. Merci beaucoup.
C'était bien de pouvoir se